welcome. Thank you for coming in on this very cloudy Saturday afternoon. I am Dineo Dupofa. I work at VIAD and I'll be moderating today's panel, which falls under our Intra-actions series. This is the first iteration of the CMRC, and it's a series of engagements that we'll be having over the course of the remainder of the year. Obviously, we're also very proud to say that the CMRC is the first of its kind in the country, first of the kind on the entire continent, and we can assertively say that it is the first bioart creative research program and laboratory in Africa. I'd like to just first give some context as to what the CMRC is, which is essentially a collaboration between VIAD and the WHRC. VIAD is the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Center, which is located in FADA, and the WHRC is the Water and Health Research Center located in the Health Sciences faculty here at UJ. So fundamentally, these are two very different research strands. One focuses on visual arts and the scholarship around that, and the other focuses on microbiology and health science. And essentially what the CMRC does is bring these two very different disciplines together in really creative ways, which allows us to be able to think about two different ways of working and thinking which inform each other and vice versa. There are different kinds of outputs, sensibilities, aesthetics, research protocols, tools, and different technologies that inform this connection, rather this intra-connectedness, as Karen Barad says. And the connection of these two disciplines come together to be able to produce the kinds of amazing works that we have on show with this exhibition that we have right in front of us. So this exhibition, this research collaboration, this very panel discussion all fall under the auspices of bioart and what we understand bioart to be today, which simply put is an intersection between biotechnology and visual art. It's a relatively new discipline. It's only been around just over 20 years or so, but it has made significant strides since then, since its inception. Some of the symbols of bioart when it first started were centered around the glow-in-the-dark bunny that glowed green, or from an Australian performance artist named Stellark, who transplanted an ear onto his arm. So this was in the early 2000s, and like I said, bioart has made significant strides since then. And in addition to the sort of developing technology of making these two very different languages work together conceptually and practically, it has evolved beyond an exploration of simply just media and materials. In some ways, it additionally includes a social and political mandate, which is the curatorial thread that runs along each of the works in this exhibition. It's been great, just to insert my own opinion here, it's been great to witness all the different ways in which these artists have revolutionized the ways in which we think about ourselves in relation to each other as well as the world that we live in, to creatively and innovatively contemplate the ways in which we occupy the world. This is, as you can imagine, a very significant undertaking. It's quite extensive. And I find it has introduced a really exciting avenue of exploration of how something so technical, so technological, and so biological can be used in the interest of visual representation and art practice, and even in decolonial practice as well as academia and scholarship. So our panelists will be sharing some interesting insights on their respective practices in response to the core question for today's panel, which is, how can bioart practitioners play a role in critically and creatively shaping our current and future ecologies by bringing new methodologies and materials into artistic realms? So how we'll start off with this, I will identify one of the panelists, they will give their response, and I'll follow up with a question or so. If anyone has any comments or questions, please hold on to them until the end. So first up, we have Tobias, Professor Tobias Barnard, who is the co-founder of the CMRC. After completing his PhD in biochemistry, he joined UJ as a postdoctoral fellow. Later, he became a principal scientist in the Water and Health Research Unit, eventually assuming the role of director at the Water and Health Research Center. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and hello, everybody. Of course, I'm the only scientist or true scientist, natural scientist, sorry for the natural scientist on the panel, and they'll come to me first. But let's see how we do this. This has been an interesting experience. Let me start from that perspective, because although scientists think they are artists as well, really working with artists has been a really interesting experience for me. My background is on microbiology and how it relates to human health, specifically water. So in 2017, we started playing with the concept of how hygiene influences the way we collect water, store water, handle water, etc. And this brought the question of how do we get people to understand the concept of microbiology when it comes to hand hygiene or hygiene in general. Because even for me, working as a microbiologist relies a lot on trust. I do 2 days worth of work without seeing anything, and then trust that in day 2 I'll see the result I want to do. Now we're trying to show the public what we have to do and how that you have to wash your hands, for instance, a simple thing, relying on the fact that you just trust me. And I don't even know if you know me, so why would you trust me? Researchers at Oxford then one day asked the question, why should we really be showing the public microbes the way that we're showing them? And it got us thinking about how do we bring the messages across to the people? It took us a while, or it took my team a while to just sit and think of what works in today's world. And we got to the realization that in today's world, the people only believe what they see, and they only believe what they see in 30 seconds. So we had to change our whole approach to science and science education to taking a seeing as believing approach that's communicated within 30 seconds. We started with some glow germ, and please go look at our social media pages. Glow germ is a fluorescent dye that people can see how they wash their hands, etc. But it wasn't enough. We wanted to almost scare people into washing their hands. And that's how we came up with the concept of exhibiting the hands the way that you see them downstairs, contaminated, and I'm using contaminated loosely, because we applied samples from normal households in Zandspruit. They were dishcloths, toilet seats, water, some soil, some surface samples, just to show you where you find pathogens and how you find pathogens. So with that as background, coming to the core question that you were asking, I realized while working on this in this field that it takes a team to create an artwork in microbial art. In my art specifically, I needed a fabricator like Zillan that you'll meet later. I had Brenton and Leora that curated the art and told me, no, the hand must move 2 centimeters that way, tilt it this way, things that I don't look at. I was going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, they're ready. So we needed the artistic input. I needed an industrial designer that helped us 3D print some of this stuff. We had people that built boxes for us because we had to literally reimagine the way we use microbiology or the way we use the techniques in microbiology. Throughout this whole experience, I kept on looking at the other art pieces, and it dawned on me that the role that microbiologists play in this realm of bioart is creating the tools for the artists. Although we have messages that we want to get across, we also need the tools. For instance, for Brenton's work, we had to create a whole set of separate way of doing things to get the pictures he wanted. For Zillan's work, he had to think about how to grow the mycelium in different ways. And for all these artists, we went with, how do we do this because nobody else is doing it? When our DVC was here, she could not believe how we made the hands and got the hands standing. She's also a microbiologist. And she made me take her to the lab to go show her how we made this. And she was literally like a small child going, I want to touch it. and she was poking it. So there's a whole role for every practitioner, as you say, in this game, but we have to work together to make the art come to the forefront, because I believe that through bioart we have the opportunity to really address sensitive and difficult topics, but we also have the opportunity to educate people in a way that we can dictate. I hope I covered the questions.
Yes, thank you. I do have some follow-up questions for you. So the aspect of collaboration is quite significant with your work and with several of the other people on the panel as well. So can you highlight one or two specific examples of challenges that you and your team faced when putting the work together?
Sure, there's a whole list. Let's start with the easiest one. Keeping artists happy. I learned the hard way that, no offense, I learned the hard way that the way that I looked at work in the lab was different from what the artist had in mind in the end. And that we sometimes blindly had to trust what the artist had in mind and just go with, this doesn't feel right from a microbiologist perspective, but here you go. And it turned out magnificent. So that was one of the reasons, or one of the difficult parts from a collaboration point of view. The other part is simply I needed technical skills that I didn't have to make things happen. The silly thing of making the hand stand like this took us a while to sort out. We went through numerous iterations of trying to do different stuff, and eventually the industrial designers went with, try this. Whoop, works, cut the hand a bit, and it stands. So the collaboration is very, very important, and without all the collaborators, I would not have be able to exhibit the hands downstairs.
And given the impact of the project, what advice would you give other scientists or researchers exploring the creative aspects of their work, even if they come from more of a scientific background?
Do it. It is fun, it's frustrating, a steep learning curve, but you're going to enjoy it. I got to learn how other people think and look at the world that we're all sharing. So I think from that perspective, it was nice. I also think that they have to do this because we need to create ways for the artist to be able to exhibit or create the art pieces that they want to do. And we need a scientist on board, otherwise this will never work.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Next up, we have Lucy Strauss, who isn't actually featured on this exhibition, but she is working in collaboration with the CMRC on some exciting things around bioelectricity and mycelium. Lucy is a musician and a researcher who designs novel interactive music systems and artworks with a performer-centric approach. She's currently pursuing a PhD in arts and computational technology at Goldsmiths and is a VIAD artist in residence.
Yeah. Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me to speak, even though I don't have a work at the exhibition. Yeah, to respond to the question on how bioartists can think ecologically and contribute new tools and methods and techniques. In terms of my own work, I work with bioelectricity, and in particular the electrical impulses in our muscles as we move. And in my own practice, I work with the electrical impulses that we use in the movements of playing musical instruments. And so when I got this bioart residency, I thought, well, that's a biological material, bioelectricity, that I am currently using. But I also wanted to kind of expand the kind of bioelectricity I was using to more other living materials. And so I was really excited when I got hold of a whole bunch of mycelium in the lab. And it turns out that mycelium also has bioelectricity, and that we can measure these electrical impulses in mycelium in a very similar way to how we can measure the electrical impulses in our own bodies, in our own nervous systems, in our muscles, in our brains, in our heart contractions. I don't want to get too technical about how we do that, but it involves tracking on 2 different points the difference in the voltage difference traveling through our brains or our muscles. And so we can do the same in mycelium. And so to me, it's this underlying kind of invisible biological process that we actually share with these living materials that are so foreign and different from us. And so I wanted to interrogate that a lot more. In humans, bioelectricity doesn't only help us, for example, to move by helping us to contract our muscles, for example, but it also, in terms of bioelectricity in muscles, it has a lot to do with our perception and how we perceive ourselves in space. So I know that my arm is raised because there's a rapid electrical firing that is going from my muscles into my brain. And so, although mycelium does not have a central nervous system where they can process this information, we can still, by tracking the bioelectricity in mycelium, we can still see a response to external stimuli from the world. So it's this way I use bioelectricity to study mycelial sensing and to get some kind of window into what is happening inside inside this living material. Yeah, and then eventually the project is still in its infancy, so it's invisible and it doesn't quite exist yet, but eventually I hope that it will be a way to generate new understandings about just what it means to be alive and this process inside us. Oh, and also in terms of new tools and methods, this is a rapidly growing but quite new area of computer science called fungal electronics that we use to actually measure mycelial bioelectricity. And so there isn't really standard practice or technique that we can use. And so we're kind of in the beginning process of, we're there busy inventing the methods and the techniques or using very new methods and techniques, even in a scientific context. And so often we record data and there's no real example of what our data should look like, and we just have to hope that we're actually picking up what we think we're picking up. So it's this very exciting and sometimes frustrating place to be in.
Thank you. I do have questions to ask you as well. So could you kind of give us an idea of how fungal electronics manifests in a visual form? I know you said the work is invisible right now, but I mean, if this had to be translated into an art object, how would you imagine that would look?
Well, I suppose I'm conceptualizing at this point. We're working towards making living mycelial sculptures. And so you would have some mycelium and then some wire electrodes inside the mycelium. I don't want to shed too many of my...
And how do you see the future of bioelectricity in art and science? Are there any emerging trends or technologies that you find exciting? Well, I think that just by making these artworks, we're going to uncover
things we didn't know about bioelectricity in mycelium, because so little of it has actually been studied and experimented on at this point. But in terms of the measuring equipment that we're using, this is, we use the same kinds of measuring equipment as we use for human biosignals, for example, EMG for muscle signals, EEG for brain signals. And so at this point, yeah, I think we kind of have what we need at this point.
This is like relatively uncharted territory, basically.
It does feel that way. There are a few labs working on this in the world, but I think we are probably...
We are the first. I'm saying it here. We're the first.
I think we're the first. Yeah, we're kind of... It's in its infancy, I think.
All right, thank you. I'm going to take it to Zilin now, who has also worked with you, Lucy, on some of the projects that you have with the CMRC. So Zilin Diaga has a background in architecture and is currently working as the project coordinator at the Water and Health Research Center and also the lab manager for the CMRC.
Thanks, Neo. So having studied as an architect, I've developed this very design-driven process, and what it's done is it's offered me this space to fertilize a very intriguing relationship with science through the exploration of design. Sorry. One of the things that it's led me to is believing in this amazing fractional area where nature can inspire design, and design plays with these ideas which science seeks to then realize. And in turn, it sparks this sort of synergetic germination of information where one discipline is the input factor to the next. And these all culminate in this very explosive moment of coalescing these seemingly interconnected ideas into the embodiment or the evocative embodiment of a new idea. I believe as bioart practitioners, we work within this wonderful little area that transcends both the canvas and the laboratory. And in this, it implores us to think beyond the imaginable when we orchestrate different disciplines, methods, and partners. And the assumption of this role is not without its social and ethical responsibilities. We must realize that our collaborators are living organisms within themselves, ones which operate in accordance with their own ethos and that we don't yet know how to communicate with. Through the process of exploration, we constantly challenge our position on having to assume the role of both being the shepherd and the sheep. And in this, it's that at some point in the process, we have to relinquish control over to the fungi or the microbes that we work with. And we have to trust that in the embodied intelligence that's been developed through nature's iterative evolvement, that they can then build on the fundamental bases that we've provided for them. This trust and this partnership creates this magical confluence of disciplines that breathes to life the permission for science to operate under the auspice of art. And one of the things that comes out of this is that it creates this newfangled Shangri-La of intellect where we can use scientific processes as artistic media. So I think the importance of being pioneering practitioners is to create an inclusive and accessible environment for the dissemination of this knowledge and insights that generate through our research, and to open that up to a broader audience. The artistic realm engages all of us on a personal, creative level. It fosters an environment that is open to intrigue, reflection, and discussion, and art in itself constructs its own emotional response, right? It fabricates its own ideas, and these are read and interpreted with the same variation as the size of the audience. So I'm inviting you to join me for a moment in conceptualizing a future where our cities are live, where they're truly living systems, where we can have buildings that collect the waste of its inhabitants to repair and to grow new extensions, where bioluminescent sidewalks not only light our nightscapes, but collect and clean water. You know, what does the air smell like in a future where photosynthetic bacterial facades power our global energy needs? In this vision, I've moved towards my work, which is now part of the SYM Art exhibition. It's the exploration of co-created futures. And what it is doing is it's trying to visualize an active research study that's looking into the viability of dormant mycelium within a gelatinous protein-bound xylem substrate. Its aim is to change the way that we interact with this material that moves away from the common methodologies of killing the mycelial culture. So, furthermore, it also stands to galvanize us in reflecting upon how much we actually rely on the interconnectedness of all of these living organisms. Through this lens, I believe that it's our role as bioart practitioners to very carefully move forward in our nurturing of nature in this collaboration of new scientific discoveries. And I think, to sum it up, an inspiration of mine, Neri Oxman, said it best, where we need to move from an era of Mother Nature into mothering nature.
Thank you. The first question I have for you, and this may be a bit speculative, but when you consider the research that you've done on mycelium, how would you relate that to, thinking about cost-effective and ecologically effective housing in the future, and what that would mean for South Africa?
So, from a material standpoint, it's far cheaper to grow things than to make things, if that makes sense. So, let's take, for instance, concrete, right? Concrete, when we culminate its environmental impact, we have to move all the way down the line to where they mine the resources that then gets made into those materials. And to grow mycelium, it's already being fed by the agro industry off of its waste, so that's one plus already. And I think in a specifically South African or African context, it's something that we can do on a much more producible scale, that we can spread throughout the country, throughout the continent, and have smaller, less factory-type areas of production. And then again, it's a wonderful material to use in something like a South African housing context, because the material in itself is hydrophobic, which means it's waterproof. It's also very mold and, funny enough, fungal resistant once it's cured. And then again, I think to roll it out, like I was pointing out, is much easier than having to roll out something like bricked or concrete housing.
All right, and also with regards to your research with mycelium, what are some of the emerging trends that you've noted in the last year or so?
In the past year or so. So it is quite a new area. It's really starting to gain traction. It's been about 4 or 5 years. And I think moving forward, the really interesting segments of it will be on how we integrate with the material as a living organism. So at the moment, most of the research moves towards how we grow it, form it, and then kill it, and then its usefulness is begun. But I think moving forward, we're looking more and more into how do we actually coexist with this material while it lives within our spaces, right? So that area of study is going to be very interesting. And moving forward, I think it's just mostly how we start to live in a world where we invite other living organisms to be in our company.
Thank you. Next up, we have Leora, Professor Leora Faber, who is a Johannesburg-based artist, academic, writer, curator, editor, and so on and so on and so on. She holds a DPhil in visual arts and is VIAD's director and co-founder of the CMRC.
Thanks, Daneo. Afternoon, everybody. My answer is slightly different in that I've grappled with this question, how can artists bring about change through new mediums, new materials, new methodologies, working with life, as it were, or life stroke living stroke non-living materials. Now, the non-stroke living materials would be those materials that fall in between living and not living. So in other words, say bacteria or viruses don't meet all the criteria for a living organism, but they also don't meet all the criteria for something that's dead. So they hover in between. And I come very much from a visual art perspective, so I really admire when art can have a purpose, as Tobias has explained, or as Zelinis explained, where you are making things that have a very practical application in the world. Whereas visual art, I think it's fairly safe to say, doesn't actively produce change. It's not a catalyst for change in the way that, say, medicine or sciences would actually, cause change. But what visual art can do is provoke questions, provoke interest, spark curiosity, and make people think, really, think differently about perhaps the world around us, and in this case, perhaps the ecosphere around us, what actually surrounds us every single day in the form of very unseen elements, tiny little microbes that we cannot see, and we just don't know about because they're not in our field of vision. They're invisible. And I think it's that fascination of revealing something that is invisible and making it visible and making it known that can lead to somebody actually starting to question beyond that. So in other words, just the simple idea that 80 or 90% of our bodies are made up of bacteria. Now, we don't think like that, actually. We don't think that, as Tobias shows in his work, the minute you touch a railing, the minute you touch a tap, the minute you touch a light switch, there's bacteria that you are coming into contact with. So you are constantly in contact with living stroke non-living materials. And we don't realize this. And what does that actually say? Because what we try, historically through colonialism, through capitalism and so on, has developed this idea that man can control the natural world or living world, that man can actually dominate and have power over that world. And so we've got things like the Anthropocene, that global warming and so on, that are now part of our reality. But if one could realize or start to come to the kind of understanding and awareness that in fact we are one and the same with the living world or non/living world, that in fact we are all one and the same, There is no dominance, there is no hierarchy. There cannot be a hierarchy, because how can you be controlling of something that is actually part of yourself, right? So for me, I think that's where bioart comes in. I also tend to think of it in more of a theoretical way. And so my training as an academic and as an artist and so on always leads me to think about concept, and the concept as something that has the catalyst for at least changing thought patterns, if not action. So with my work, I take quite a decolonial slant in that the material, okay, let me put it this way. The material is matter, but the material also matters. So in other words, I'm using the material for certain properties that it can convey conceptually, right? So let's say I'm working with agar and bacteria. Now, I made a series of objects, some of which you can see fragments of behind me, made them out of bacterial agar, and then painted the bacteria on top of the agar. Agar is like jelly, and it's the substance that bacteria grow on in Petri dishes. And yeah, in making those objects, and I think this is something that many of my colleagues have said, one loses a sense of yourself as an autonomous being. You start to realize I and the bacteria are actually collaborating. I'm not the artist anymore. I'm not the person in control. And that's where I kind of make an analogy between, let's say, people cutting down whole forests and something. If to do that, you obviously don't have any empathy or respect for the natural world that you controlling or asserting dominance over. Whereas working with these actual microbes just led me to realize I'm part of them and they are part of me. They cannot be controlled. I lose my autonomy as an artist because it's not like other mediums where you can, say, do a bronze cast and you know exactly what's going to happen. They have a life force of their own. The bacteria have got their own life force. You can call it what you like, but you can say it's living or not, but it's an agency of sorts, right? It's a life force of sorts. So what it does for me, and I would hope that maybe that would start coming through in my work, is start breaking down these boundaries between what is human and not human, what is living and not living. What is my ego and where does that ego start to fall away? And promoting a kind of thinking which is very much more in synergy with the ecosphere around us. So it's kind of in a long-winded way, and not a direct way, like I started off saying. Visual art is often, it makes its point, or the artist makes their point through a poetic means, or a imaginative means, or a, how can I say, a very indirect means, but you are still dealing with a concept. And I think that it's that concept that you're trying to put across that might spark a different way of thinking and a different way of imagining the world.
Thank you for that. So my first question directed to you is more so in relation to your work. When you say sometimes how visual art doesn't have a direct or kind of quantifiable impact is the same as the medical sciences would, for example. But it does have the power to raise public awareness, to provoke questions and provoke responses and awareness in the public. And with your work, one thing in particular that stood out to me, when you start speaking about the kind of like colonial legacy of Delft porcelains and ceramics, and how most people associated it with being a Dutch kind of like innovation when it's actually from China.
Right.
So can you speak a little bit about that in relation to your work? So I think it's more so the conceptual aspects of your work.
Right. I think that's where I was coming in and saying that's more the conceptual aspects and the way in which the medium can support those conceptual aspects. So, for instance, the works behind me were, they were actually failures. They were actually things, bits of the agar that I'd painted on that I wanted to throw away. And then realized, okay, maybe they actually have a kind of beauty in themselves. Now, those are based on the Dutch Delft porcelain, which we all know, the blue and white pot, the blue and white designs, the windmill, etc. And it's been known as Delft porcelain because it was originally made in the city of Delft in Holland. And that's I think, all we kind of think about it, really. That's where our thinking stops. So we see this, particularly in the Cape, a lot of this Delft pottery everywhere. But one doesn't actually stop to think of the history that actually is embedded in that object or a reproduction of that object. It doesn't have to be the original. The reproduction also carries the legacy, the history. What actually is the case, as Dineo said, is through the Dutch East India Company. It was through trade and through imperialism. They went over to China. They looked at the blue and white pottery, stole, appropriated, whatever word you want to use, brought it back to Holland and claimed it as their own. The British did exactly the same thing, except they'd adapted the pattern to more like Wedgwood or Royal Dalton, where you would have a blue and white rose, like the English rose. That in turn got shipped to the colonies, particularly in South Africa, being, the Dutch and the English being our colonialists, if you like, the people that colonized us. And so these legacies, but also these values systems that are embedded in everyday objects, get transposed into new cultures and become part of that culture. So we might think of, drinking tea out of a Royal Dalton teacup, but nobody actually thinks, wow, this came from England, it came via the China and was exported, let's say, to Holland, together with other luxury goods like spices and teas and so on, and slaves. And those very same slaves were brought from Holland into the colonies, let's say, into the Cape. Now, what does that say? It says that the luxury goods and the porcelain and so on were equated with objects which were equated with slavery. So in other words, the idea that slaves were amongst the things that you traded and brought to the colonies. So I think for me, that's the interesting part, is looking at traces or remnants of colonialism that still permeate our everyday existence. We're not aware of it most of the time. One doesn't think, okay, I'm having a lovely cup of tea out of my Royal Dalton teacup. You just appreciate that, right? But everywhere, I think, that one looks, there are these very subtle, very quiet, very nuanced traces of colonialism that we're not even aware of. So I know these are quite complex sort of ideas that all flow into each other, and it's kind of strange. But there's also the idea that bacteria can be like a settler colony, and viruses can be like colonialism itself, right? So I like these kind of mixed metaphors. I spoke about medium earlier, and for me, the agar, working on that agar, was very important. It wouldn't have been the same if I'd been working on some other material. Why? Because it is slimy, it is initially liquid, and then you set it and it sets like jelly in the fridge. But it's something you can't hold on to it. It's not all that tangible. It's like, taking a lump of jelly and holding it in your hand. It's ephemeral in a way. It doesn't keep. You can keep it in the fridge for a certain amount of time, but it will, if you take it out the fridge, shrivel up and become moldy and nasty. So it's the ephemerality of the medium that also talks about these traces, these hauntednesses, these fugitive kind of hauntings of colonialism that are around us. Yeah. I don't know if any of that made sense, because one idea was leading into the next.
It does. When you speak about the historical remnants and bacteria as a metaphor, I think it echoes quite strongly in your work, and as is the same case with Melissa, for example. So I think we'll just direct it to you now. Let me just introduce her. So Melissa Nziba is an architecture practitioner and researcher. She completed her Master of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg and is currently a VIAD Research Associate. So yes, I will bring that on to you now.
Do you mind just repeating?
Oh, sorry. So the context of what Lior was speaking about with the kind of historical remnants, so kind of these ghostly passages, if you know, you'd like to use that term, in relation to the idea of colonialism or the colonial legacy or thread that, you know, we still deal with in our everyday life. But when we speak about your work in particular, you know, that idea of the remnants is still there, the ruins, but also the remains of the enslaved children that were on the shipwreck. So can you just explain a little bit more about that with regards to your work, and then maybe after that we can lead on to your response to the core question?
Yeah. So I'll start by saying that I approach architecture as a practice of manifesting the fantasy of people through space making. And so the reason why I approach architecture in this way, and it's something that I had investigated in my thesis, it's that the colonial and apartheid spatial planning was a product of the colonialist imagination that produced a utopic version of reality, one in which Black people were rendered invisible or reduced to labor in so-called white spaces. And so I reimagine space through fabulation, through child play, and through performance. And so just to give you background on my work, what it first started at was a mapping exercise. It was a mapping exercise in which I mapped the spatial condition of the shipwreck of the Sao Jose Paquete Africa. It was a shipwreck that happened in 1794 off the coast of Clifton Fourth Beach. And what I map is the underwater condition, but not only the underwater condition, but the presence of the drowned slave children, whose presence is not recognized in the archive. And my work is about interrogating the adultification of Black children in South Africa. And so in that context, you know, Black children are rendered adult in order to fulfill their sole duty as labor. And so in mapping that spatial condition, you know, this was the first step in like relinquishing control, you know, as Dylan has spoken about and Lior has spoken about, where I first started mapping the underwater condition that was documented by the divers of the Slave Wrecks project, and I mapped it through sand play and performance, which I captured through the medium of film. I then introduced mycelium to that system, and in my narrative, the remains of the drowned slave children through the process called eutrophication was transformed into algal bloom. And what happens in the process of eutrophication is that when there's an excess of nutrients introduced to a water body, it causes the overproduction of algae in that system, which then rises to the surface. It blocks out oxygen and sunlight, and which then accelerates the production of algae in the water, and this produces what is called algal bloom, which rises to the surface of the water. And that was, in my narrative, the first evidence of that erasure of the black children in my narrative. I then mapped their journey as algal drift, which is a condition in which algae travels like vast expanses of water. And in my narrative, the algal bloom traveled from Cape Town to the island of Mozambique, which is where the children were first kidnapped from, which is to become their final resting place. And then I proposed the colonization of the ruin of the Chapel Nossa Senhora de Baluarte, which is also said to be the oldest colonial structure in southern Africa. And the colonization of this ruin by the algal bloom, by the children. And so the work becomes, an interrogation of preservation, the preservation of built fabric, the preservation of colonial structures. Colonial structures are protected by heritage laws. And so I make a case for the natural demolition of these structures. And so the chapel ruin becomes the scaffold for this new landscape to emerge. The work has become about challenging the idea of preservation. Because the preservation of these built structures is also the preservation of a paradigm. And, through that preservation, there is it makes it difficult for any paradigm shifts to occur. And through this project, I've also begun to make sense of my practice and the methodologies that I use in spatial mapping, and a practice that I'm calling analog modeling as child play, where I use methodologies, the methodology of analog modeling from geology, as methodologies like experimentation, modeling, simulation, and I redefine that as child play, where I model space, but also propose, alternate spatial realities, alternate presence, alternate futures. And I think what's really exciting about it is that in an age where there is a push for, the development of digital 3D modeling, and now 3D modeling using, AI technology. I think that we're not really pushing analog modeling methodologies as far as we could push them. There's still a space for analog modeling, in this age, I think.
And then with regards to spatial mapping, how would you say you balance the scientific aspects with the more artistic side of how you put the work together?
So in my research, I had learned about a writing methodology called critical fabulation. This is a methodology that was coined by Saidiya Hartman, and this is specifically to do with work that she does when she in the interrogation of the colonial archive and the gaps that are present in the colonial archive, and making sense of how to fill in those gaps using fabulation. And so in using both empirical evidence, archival evidence, and then weaving it together with storytelling, you're able to reimagine lost histories. And then to be able to then speculate alternate,
And then, this idea of speculation and reimagining kind of alternate perspectives and realms. How do you think that could relate to the broader discussions around archival practice in South Africa, especially around the omission of black bodies?
So I think, this is something that I became exposed to at the Graduate School of Architecture, and specifically in the unit that I was in Unit 19. That was founded by Tulisa Cindy, and she was my supervisor, and Mohammed Doji was my co-supervisor. In that unit, we explored alternate ways of mapping, alternate ways of recording data that are a departure from how mapping is defined how it's defined through modernity or through the lens of modernity. And so ways of mapping that have been previously invalidated or not considered scientific or not considered empirical data, not considered accurate. These are methodologies that we are exploring and validating through our explorations.
And thank you for your insights on that. I want to kind of hinge on the point that you mentioned about the preservation of colonial structures and apartheid structures and the ruins, and how that also echoes quite strongly in Brenton's work. So I'll have him speak next. So Brenton Mott works in many forms, in concepts, images, texts, and structures. His current independent projects merge institutional collaborations, cultural activism, design, curating, editing, writing, visual art production, and creative archival practice. Brenton holds an MA in Fine Arts from Wits and an MSc in Biotechnology from Rhodes, and is the first artist in residence under the CMRC. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Sano. I made notes, but in the interest of interactivity, I won't refer to them. I mean, a lot of things really stood out for me, but one of the sort of common threads that I picked up with almost everybody was how the sector of bioart, one of the primary things that it does is it works towards breaking down artificial boundaries between things. These sort of dichotomies that have been put in place over time, through psychologies, through economics, through politics. And one of the key things that bioart tries to do is to kind of break down these, what effectively are artificial dichotomies. Leora put it quite succinctly when she said that one of her interpretations of bioart is to sort of punt the mandate of the continuum. And I find that a really exciting aspect of the sector as a whole. I find it quite weird that there is this dichotomy does exist between the science and the arts, because, and I know I've said this before, and I've been shouted down by artists who argue for the sort of the rarity, the special nature of art production, when actually in my eyes and in my practice, I don't see the two as completely separate. I remember when I worked as a scientist, as a biotechnologist, I was quite struck at that time, and that was in my distant past, that was 20 years ago. I was quite struck by how a lot of the scientific disciplines that I worked in used the means of the visual to be able to draw conclusions, So it was, and that was the sort of mode of, that was what people were working towards, to be able to visualize it. And you saw it through something as simple as photographs, through graphical representations, tables are a form of visualization and so forth. So one of the primary pieces of evidence of scientific work is the visual. And similarly with artistic practice as well. I mean, what artistic practice does is it draws very strongly into its method of production the technical. I mean, if you think of something as commonly known as oil painting, I mean, the sort of technology, the science and the physics and the chemistry involved in something as simple that we assume to be an artistic medium as oil painting is so imbued with technology and with chemistry and so forth. So personally and also professionally, I find this dichotomy between the science and the arts really quite debilitating. And so one of the primary things in answer to the core question, one of the primary exciting things that I see bioart in doing is in breaking down these boundaries, between biology, specifically in this case, and art. And I find that quite exciting. That's the one thing to say. In my own work, I suppose it's also quite a good reference in my own work, I mean, I trained as a photographer. And I trained as a photographer before the invention of the digital. And my first cameras were film cameras. Thank God for moisturizer. That's all I can say. So one of the first cameras that I had were analog cameras. So I worked with film and I worked with wet processing and I worked as a darkroom technician for a number of years. In fact, one of the most exciting things that I've ever done in my life was work as a darkroom technician. And a lot of that is that is chemistry, that is physics, that is light physics, that is chemistry with wet chemicals and so forth. So, and one of the exciting things, to return to my own work, of what bioart allows me to do, and I think that kind of like points the way for future work in bioart, is, and Melissa said this, is the return to the analog, is this move away from the sort of insistence on the digital. I mean, over the past 10 years or so, the rise of social media has resulted in this hyperglut of images. I mean, I've now recently rejoined Instagram. I'm not too sure if that was a good idea, but I spend hours, I waste so much time on my phone, on social media, flipping through images and scrolling, and then at the end of the day, I can't remember anything that I've actually seen. So it's using the sense of the visual, but not actually gaining anything from that. And that is what digital technology has done. It has made us lose the power to interpret one of our primary senses, which is the sense of the visual. It's made us lose the ability to interpret what we see. And for me, I mean, I find that working with biological organisms, working in the lab, working with lab technicians, and kind of like working with their technologies and through their eyes and with their hands and in their labs, what has been quite exciting is that there is no greater analog, as you were talking about, there is no greater manifestation of the analog than the biological system. I mean, it's the antithesis of the digital system, It's slow, it's organic, it's unpredictable. You've just got to go with what happens. It is truly an analog system. So one of the primary things that I find exciting about the sector is that the practice of bioart allows for the return to the analog, and we see that. I mean, we see that all over. You see the rise of handcrafts, for example, becoming more and more desirable as opposed to machine-produced things. You see the hand-printed photograph, ironically, becoming more valuable than this mass-produced digital artwork. So there's a return, and it's not just a romantic thing. It's also a return of kind of value, a system of value. Not just financial value, but also sort of value, a sort of psychic value that is that the analog object is imbued with. And I find that bioart does that for me in quite a strong way. Just one other thing to say, I'm just kind of thinking about what I said in my notes. Just one other thing to say is that a strong political, and Leora was talking about this also, there's a strong political reason for me practicing as a bioartist is because of how it allows us to break down those artificial boundaries. And for me, that is a political act, because a big part of of politics and economics, and one of the key symptoms of late capitalism, is in putting in place these artificial boundaries, And what bioart does for me is it allows me to break down those boundaries, which I see as a political act. in terms of the actual work of decolonization linked to this production, to this use of the analog, I find that really exciting from a political, from an political activist point of view also. Because for me, what is decolonial practice? Decolonial practice for me is trying to put in place, trying to do something that actively works against the prevailing context that is so destructive to people on Earth. You can see that, I don't want to hark back to, the policies and practices of colonialism and apartheid, but, we can't actually get away from looking at those, at the insidious effects. We drag the weight of history along with us, whether we like it or not, whether we see it or not, it's in everything that we do. If we look at Nathaniel Stern's installation, for example, the practice of child mining of cobalt in the Congo that is used for these pieces of equipment. We look at this and we see electronic waste, but actually just looking a little bit deeper and just reading a little bit more, we actually realize how insidious the practice of colonial practice is imbued, and we just don't see it. It's invisible to us. But I'm sort of getting off the point. The key point I want to make here in terms of decolonial practice is, what this project has done for me. I've been working as an artist in residence for the past year at UJ, and it's just been extended for another, and I'm really looking forward to the second year, because the first year was just kind of laying the groundwork. And what this practice past year has done is it's allowed me to slow down. In antithesis to the digital, the production and the use of the digital, this analog process allowed me to slow down not only just my practice, but also the way I look at things. And it's allowed me to bring together, again, in antithesis to this kind of this putting in place separate boundaries between the brain and the eye. It's allowed me to bring together more closely and in more greater combination my brain and my eye. And to go back to colonial and apartheid practices, that was one of the key ways in which colonial and apartheid practices were perpetuated, was in not just in policy but also in practice, of this decoupling our vision from our ability to interpret and talk and act upon our visions. And we see that in something as simple as Bantu education, which did away with arts and culture education in schools. We see that in terms of language colonization, where people were made to feel insecure about how we were talking and the language that we were using. And that specifically was a colonial and apartheid practice, to be able to separate what we were seeing from our ability to talk and act upon it. And I think that this strive towards the analog, this bringing together of kind of like the mind and the vision in an analog system is, for me, it's a political activism against those policies. It's a way of slowing things down, of making us realize that we can see, and our sense of the visual is central to our evolution of a species. We are who we are because of the sense of visual, more than any other sense. The sense of the visual has allowed us, I think it's like something like crazy, like more than 50% of our brain is dedicated towards the it's like 80% of our brain that is used to or something significant like that, towards analyzing the sense of the visual. And for me, this is what this kind of like slowing down of the process of production and looking has done. It's allowed me certainly, to be able to draw closer links between the brain and the eye. And to go back to end on on the point that I started at, this dichotomy, this false dichotomy, the split between the arts and the science, really can be done away with. But the brain and the eye can be brought closer together through the practice of bioart. It presents not only just a sort of technical possibility, but also conceptual and a political possibility.
Thank you for that, Brenton. You actually answered all of the questions I was going to ask you. So with that, I will move on to Nelisiwe Klava, who is a performance artist, dancer, and choreographer. She received a scholarship to study at the Johannesburg Dance Foundation, as well as the Rembrandt School of Ballet and Contemporary Dance in London, and worked with the Pact Dance Company and Free Flight Dance Company. So, I just wanted to touch on the theme of decay and ruin, which again makes reference to Brenton's work. But then when we speak about it in terms of your performance, which you had recently at the GSA room, it's called Fraught, Mold, Decay, and State of the Nation. So for those that weren't able to see the performance, could you just contextualize what the work was for you and kind of how it fits into the realm of what bioart is for us today?
Hello, everyone. Well, actually, when Leora and Brenton invited me, I was like, I don't know what to do. I don't know anything about biology. What am I going to do? But they kindly gave me time to think about it and to get lost. Then I thought, actually, I've been frustrated with the state of this country. In a way, morally, even though normally I don't care about morals, but the rot of the country is really a moral question. And I thought, actually, it would be interesting to make parallels between the rot and the mold, understanding very well that, fungus is not fraught. but then I used, just as research for myself, I went into an experiment of just simply making mold out of bread, and then just watching this mold grow, which I actually quite fell in love with, which then actually inspired the blanket that I used in the piece, which was knitted by Hanele Becker, whom I had asked to make like a 2x2 kind of thing, and then it ended up, I think, being bigger than that. Can't remember now, probably 2, maybe 3x4. But the inspiration, of the blanket came from the mold, just watching the textures, the world that the mold creates, because I think the first, or probably the only time that I've seen mold is just a tiny little bit on bread and, or on vegetables, and it's disgusting, you throw it away. And you don't just scrutinize it and say, oh, amazing, this guilt of throwing away, this food that was supposed to be consumed. Anyway, so the inspiration came from that mold. My medium is the body, or my medium is live performance, coming from the body. So, but this process, came from, I started with other things outside of my body, the blanket, and then sound. I needed sound. I think possibly just for traditional use, that maybe it's not interesting to dance or to move in silence, and it can be done. So I invited this young ASMR artist, Joshua Brenton, to come and collaborate with me. Actually, I had wanted him to make sound for me. Actually, I met him probably about in June when I was in Grahamstown working with him as a student for another piece that I did for the National Arts Festival. And he did sound for that, so, then I thought, I cannot arrive at what the sound will be. What is I said to him once, can you think about doing sound, molding sound or sound that molds? Then, last minute, I thought, actually, he should come here and just practice and do the ASMR practice that he does. Speaking to, I guess, corruption. So I brought him in, and we used a video projection. Basically, we were just seeing what was on the table, and what was on the table was just junk food, which kind of symbolizes, materialism and probably the effects of sadly corruption that, in my opinion, people are not, especially if you look at the entrepreneuring sector, I'm calling it sector, because actually it has become a sector on its own, gangsterism in a way. It's a practice. I mean, everyone knows about it, but everyone talks about it under the table. So anyway, so the table was full of junk and expensive toy cars, and all the things that unfortunately our corruption goes into consuming that. And then Joshua was kind of whispering, words that we could hear and not. In a way, it became for me very, because the rot happens, in a way it takes time. Talking about the parallels between mold and rot, that actually both of them happen, takes time to happen. It's not just something that, started yesterday and then it was a phenomenon. So that was the performance. And then I was inside, underneath, kind of like navigating the mold. I'm not sure who I was, whether it was the mold or I was the rot. Anyway, my work doesn't, I think I prefer to keep it vague in a way and leave it up to the audience to see what they see and sometimes provoke or even spark conversations.
So on that note, the form of the body and the medium of live performance, especially in context to the concept of your work, what about the medium of live performance is successful for you in this regard?
Well, the nature of live performance is, it's that it doesn't last. It's ephemeral. It has a start and an end, even though the performance pretended not to have a start and an end. It could continue, but it's ephemeral, so you have to consume it now. And you eat what you can, and you remember what you ate or not. And in a way, I think, talking about photography, in a way, you take pictures, or there's pictures that are created that you keep, that one can analyze by themselves. Later or as it happens.
And then earlier you kind of raised the question of whether you are the mold or the rot or the enabler of the rot. So how would you imagine that metaphor, or rather how would you locate that metaphor within the larger realm of bioart?
Sorry, come again.
Okay, let me start again. So when you had mentioned where in the performance you weren't sure if you were the mold or the rot, or if you were the person enabling that, right? And how that kind of speaks back to the politics of the country and the idea around consumption and overconsumption. How would you locate that metaphor? How would you kind of translate that metaphor to any kind of conversations around bioart based on what you've been exposed to it so far, given that your introduction to it happened fairly recently, within the last few months? So based on what you've been able to come across and expose yourself to with regards to bioart or the field of bioart, how would you kind of maybe relate the idea of performance to that? Let me rephrase it in that way.
I mean, it's a new medium for me, even though there's parallels. I mean, my last piece, was it the last piece? Anyway, there's a piece I did which was called Bang Bang Woo. The theme, I guess, was help. And I used different grains, to tell the story around the theme of help, interrogating what is help, looking at ways of, the hierarchy of help. So the idea when I was doing that piece was, in the end, it was a live performance, and the idea was that it never happened. That the grains will be left behind, and then let's see how they grow, or let's see what what happens. Meaning, there's a few things that could happen. It's either, they'll get, go back to the nature, and they'll come back as grains, but maybe they don't come back, especially if you buy them from Monsanto, or or the birds or animals will eat them. So in a way, I do kind of practice, but I will never probably call myself a bioart artist. Just so that I don't have to answer scientific questions.
All right. I think that was an interesting example you gave about the remnants of the grains and kind of almost relinquishing control, letting them do their thing, and kind of letting nature take over, which kind of speaks to Zillan and the reference he made from Neri Oxman, I believe it is, the difference between Mother Nature and mothering nature, and how, we don't need to have a direct impact in letting, in your case, the grains do their thing. You just let them go as is, and you let Mother Nature do its thing, as opposed to kind of forcing your will upon it, which is something Leora had spoken about in the process of creating her work, not imposing her will on the work or on the outcomes of what she wanted the work to be, but to let the bacteria act on its own, grow on its own, at its own pace, in its own time. So thank you for that, and thank you to all the panelists for your insights. I think we can close it there and open the floor to the audience. If you have any questions or comments, just raise your hand, and then we'll have Sinead come over to you with a microphone.
I've got a question for Leora, because just thinking about how agar is used in laboratories, they would usually grow specimens on the agar itself. So did you think of the painting as introducing a specimen and is it like an activation agent? Is that something that went through your mind? And what were the pigments? Were they biological in nature? Were they considered as some kind of activating agent, for example?
Okay, so I was actually working with pigmented bacteria. Okay, so I would have, the agar is transparent, translucent, jelly-like substance, and I would be, I don't want to use the word painting, it's not actually painting, drawing, using swabs and making the bacteria quite liquid. Being a painter myself, I suppose, the idea of painting with the bacteria is how I think about it, right? So I'm always thinking of the agar as a kind of canvas or a kind of surface, and the bacteria as paint in a way. Except it took me a long time to realize the bacteria are not paint. Paint stays neatly within its, wherever you put it, you make a brush mark and that brush mark stays as a brush mark. Whereas if you make you take a swab and you swab bacteria over agar, it will do whatever, as everybody's been, I think really everybody's been saying, it has its own life force, it will do what it wants. So I'm not sure. Yeah, sometimes I would just let the bacteria penetrate into the agar. So, for instance, in that image, I would have probably taken a syringe and actually just injected the bacteria into the agar, and then just let it color the agar as it wished to, So I'm not sure if that really answers your question.
Sorry, it's just interesting for me because usually there's also this reference to creating a culture.
That's it.
In a petri dish. This was almost like you introducing culture with all the colonial references that you were also talking about, which I thought was quite interesting. And is that something that also came to mind? I haven't seen the exhibition yet, so I'm just looking at stuff in front of me.
Sure. This particular series is, it's actually a very large body of work that I've got, and these are only just 6 examples of objects that I made. It's called Colonial Cultures, colonizing, no, I've got
Colonial cultures, cultural colonies.
Thank you. Thanks, Daneo. Right. And it's very much playing on that idea. You've got these colonies of bacteria that get cultured into something. So it becomes like almost a metaphor for colonialism being brought into the colony, and that it tries to culture the colony. You could even look at it as words like civilization, bringing civilization to the uncivilized. So there's all these kind of really nice analogies that I am thinking about anyway. Yeah.
I am now an audience member. I'd like to just pick up on the analog versus digital thread, because in the signals, the biosignals that I am using, for example, in our muscles, it's actually a digital signal in our bodies. It's not an analog signal because it's a rapid firing of action potential. So it's not like there's a continuous flowing of current in my muscle. It's actually multiple streams of on, off rapidly, and that has a frequency. And then we use analog sensors to then pick up that digital signal, and then through an analog to digital converter, we convert that signal then to a digital signal again in order for us to do all sorts of signal processing and analysis and feature extraction in different ways. And that's where I suppose some machine learning comes in as a way to interpret the signal that we now have. But and so I've been thinking about it in my own work, I guess, as maybe this distinction between analog as to do with the living natural world and digital to do with computers and electronics is maybe not quite what we think. Though I love this idea of analog methodologies being really pushed and revisited. Anyway, I wondered if anyone has anything to say about that.
I think Melissa and Brenton spoke about it quite extensively and shared some really great insights on that. I don't know if anyone else from the audience would like to include. Yes, Brenton.
I can comment on that.
Okay.
Thanks. That's really interesting to think of electricity signals as a digital signal. I still see it though as originating in an organic form. You know, the signal itself may be an on-off thing, which partly defines what digital is.
Yeah.
But for me, I still maybe I'm a sort of romantic in that regard. I see the sort of like the body, the embodiment of that signal, as the thing that gives that signal, that gives that thing its form. I know that is a romantic thing to say, but the real comment I want to make is sort of tangential to that. It's that what I've been doing with my work is, in antithesis to the digital production, is a biological form of visualization. Is basically just, I actually forgot to say that earlier, so I thought I'd just use this opportunity to slip that in. So thanks for that opportunity. So when I say tangential, I mean not at all, but I have another point to make. And that's introducing a new form of visualization into the sector of visual arts production through biological growth, which I think Melissa and I, in fact, almost everybody is doing. It's quite a sort of like, it's a new way of making images. And because images are meaning, it's a new way of making meaning. As it stands in relation to a digital form of making images, which is a totally different way of making them. I also love how you use the term machine learning. Do you mean by that artificial intelligence?
Yeah.
Is that what you mean by that? I love that phraseology.
Well, machine learning is a technique, and then artificial intelligence, to my understanding, is a sort of possibly more conceptual thing that we apply to those techniques, because machine learning, there are a lot of other different techniques in AI. For example, evolutionary computing is not machine learning, but it's also an artificial intelligence technique. But yeah. The signals were traveling.
Right.
Sorry.
So yeah, I think I really appreciate that, what you said about, it's not as black and white as analog versus digital. And so, I don't know that I can really comment right now about, what that distinction is. But I think in how you've described your work, or in how I'm maybe beginning to understand it, and that relationship between the digital and analog, it sounds like there's this constant translation that's happening between the two, because it's not black and white. In order to understand this one output that's happening digitally, you need to translate it through an analog process, and then again translate that back into back again into like you were describing just now. So I think for me that's something that sounds really exciting about, your inquiry, the idea of translation, and what that means. I don't know that there's a contestation between the analog and digital, but it's got an interesting space, I think, in that conversation.
We can go further and do more things if we use analog and digital techniques in very specific ways so on a smaller scale, but then on a larger scale when looking at analog methodologies as like the basis of your entire work here.
Right, yeah. Cool.
Yes, Brenton.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's quite interesting. I mean, that sort of translation and the move between the digital and the analog. I mean, it feeds into that idea that it is a dichotomy, and it's not really. I mean, as you say in your work, it's not really a kind of real. It's not a real thing, because in an organic system you have digital form of communication, which is the nerve impulse. So I like that how it breaks down that dichotomy as well. And you find that in photography also, in sort of technical production of photography, that move between the digital and the analog is surprisingly common. I mean, the most simple thing is scanning of negatives, but it also works the other way, where images that are being shot on digital are now being converted into a film material, which is then used in a printing process. As a sort of like as a romantic return to the analog form of production.
So you find some form of nostalgia that some people may have, yeah.
Sure. And a form of nostalgia for me has got a bit of a worrisome tone to it. It's sort of like it. For me, in my mind, it conjures up this kind of like this wish for a time that is past, and kind of doesn't do justice to the contemporary. I would phrase it more in terms of, I don't know, finding value in slow production, basically. The return to, labor of love.
It's a more meditative approach, a kind of, a return to being more meditative. Thank you, Brenton, for your insights on that, and Relisa and Lucy. I don't know if there's any more insights, questions, considerations. Yes.
Hello, hi everyone. I just want to say the presentations were good. I liked the points that everyone brought up. It's pretty interesting. I'm going to excuse me for any faux pas while I proceed in tying together my thoughts, but I just think it's interesting that machine learning came up because of this big debate that's going on now with AI that's coming out, and the fact that what we're actually talking about right now is life at the end of the day. And the debate around AI is about it being sentient or not, which I think is cool and ties into a lot of the discussions that have been happening here. And when you really think about it, it is a deep question. When you think about the materials that you're working with as well, like, is this thing alive? And you can liken it to people as well, I guess, because a thing about apartheid was that white people didn't think that black people were intelligent. Were they intelligent? Are they smart? Are they alive? Are they, how do they move? How does it work? So I just think that's interesting how it came back to something that's actually happening right now, and it's busy developing. So you also spoke about the boundaries. I think a big concept that's I think is also happening now is I might be wrong, I think it's called synchronicity, how all fields sort of come together and you always find like layers crossing each other and references that you can relate to in each and every field. And it can also, again, relate back to life with people, how we can, regardless of differences, we find similarities. So I just think it was a cool presentation.
Thank you for that. If we have no further comments or questions from the audience, I think we can close it. Sorry?
I just have one.
Please share it with us. Please share it.
Okay. Just as one quick thing. You know what? I mean, for me, this is it's a spiritual discussion. this move towards bringing, and Leora alluded to this also, the sort of move towards bringing things, and this is exactly what you were saying, bringing very different things together as they should be together, you know? I mean, Nelly spoke about it also when she was talking about where do these seeds and grains go, you know? Do they kind of go into the soil, and do they become recomposted and kind of go into the cycle of things? And I mean, composting is a really good example of that kind of singularity, for lack of a better word. And for me, this is a spiritual practice. I know it is also a technical and a biological and an artistic practice, but it's also a spiritual practice in that it allows these very different things to come together. I mean, Leora was talking about this, to break down this distinction between us and the bacteria, you know. We are not in control. We are not the sort of top feeders in this chain, because without all these other things, without the sort of biodiversity that supports us, we would not be alive. So for me, this practice of bioart is very much also a spiritual practice, in that it allows us to see ourselves within the context of equal importance on this earth and in a greater sort of sphere. So for me, I just want to say that as well, that it's a spiritual practice. Which also reinforces the notions of collaborating and coexisting with the bacteria and all the other life forms that are around us. So yeah, thank you for that.
Sorry, this is a bit sort of off the track, and I hope you won't see this as any kind of insult, Tobias. But I wanted to pick up on the idea of science, and obviously the distinction between science and art, and all those binary opposites that were introduced at the time of the Enlightenment. They were reintroduced and reinforced during modernism, where we had all these dichotomies between mind and body, rationality, insanity, black and white, you know, it became a racial thing as well, hot and cold, all of that stuff. And thinking how science was always, in those binary dichotomies, associated with, number one, the masculine, and number two, rationality, right? And art being exactly the opposite, being associated with creativity. And to some degree, although it didn't play out like that, there was the male genius, but some degree art being seen as the more irrational, which would feminize it in a way. And you were speaking a lot about visuality. And part of those dichotomies were vision and rationality in contrast to the body and matter. And so I was thinking, you know, in science, visuality was used as a means of control. So it's a bit like in medicine, right? You're looking at the other. You're looking at microbes, you're looking at bacteria, etc. You're studying it through a microscope, through a lens, right? In other words, those bacteria, there's a huge gap between the bacteria and the person who has the power of looking. It's the power of the gaze, right? So it's an interesting thing, because now what we're doing is breaking down that exact hierarchical relationship. And so visuality takes on a different kind of meaning in the way that we are working, right? It's not a visuality about the autonomous male being, the scientist or the medical doctor or whatever, looking at bacteria as some kind of inferior specimen, right?
Interesting topic. I hope there's no bottles to throw. Yes. Okay, so no offense taken, but I think let's start with the spiritual part. I think humans in totality were taught a sudden and, what's the other word? A sudden lesson by microbiology in 2019. Where something that we can't see, can't conceptualize, forced the whole world to a standstill with everybody locked indoors, too scared to move outside. So I think even the microbiologists have, although we have had a better appreciation, the whole world in the span of 2 years realized that microbes will outlive us, and microbes control us. Whether you like it or not, microbes are controlling everything you do. And this is the science that's coming up now that is breaking those boundaries, where a lot of the medical sciences are looking at the symbiosis between microbes and the human host, where the science is showing that the type of microbes in your gut will influence the way your mental health is. The type of microbes will influence your weight loss, your everything. So I think a lot of the microbiologists are going towards a more synergistic effect, to go, how can we live with you instead of trying to get rid of you? So I think from that perspective, we are trying to break the boundaries, to go, we're not looking at you, we are still looking at you to try and understand you, but there's a more respect and appreciation for what you can do and what you can contribute. Because even as microbiologists understand the fact that up to date, we know about 1% of all microbes in this world. 1% we know about. We've studied to an extent, we've identified, or we have been able to grow them. There's 99% of microbes that we have no idea about. When we do the sequencing runs, we see all these different sequences, all these different strains that we just simply don't know about. And I think the newer technologies have shown us where our place in this world is. We are not the top of the food chain in any means, or in my opinion, humble opinion. We are not at the top of the food chain. And I think Brenton made a nice point that I never thought of, is that scientists forget how we rely on the visual arts. When you were talking about the photographs, it took me back to my days as an honors student, where I had to develop films for radioactive exposures and stuff. And it's something that when you were talking about the chemicals, and I got these flashbacks of me standing with the developer and the stopper and all those other things. I think we underappreciate how visual arts, maybe not in the way that you're presenting it, but has always impacted our lives, and the way that we are now being asked to represent our work in an easier to understand format with everything we submit. So I think we're getting there. It's still a long way to go, but I think we're getting there.
That's interesting. It's good to hear that some strides are being made. So I guess that's a wrap for Intra-actions Part 1. Thank you, everyone.